In a world of perfect lawns and polite smiles, a small ceramic owl was a capital offense. This is Evergreen Ridge, a place where retired Marine Marcus had found solace in his garden after a lifetime of service. But his quiet peace was shattered by the low hum of an approaching golf cart. It was Roger, the self-appointed king of the HOA, a man who had traded a desk job for a badge he made himself. He didn't speak. He just gestured to the small owl, a quiet insult to a man of quiet dignity. The crowd watched, and Marcus stood unblinking as Roger tore a violation notice from his clipboard, a final, public act of humiliation. He left the notice on the lawn like a gauntlet, leaving Marcus alone with the cold paper and the silent judgment of his neighbors. The morning sun, an almost liquid gold, dripped over the perfectly manicured lawns of Evergreen Ridge. It illuminated the neat rows of two-story homes, each a testament to suburban tranquility and a collective agreement to uphold a certain standard of quiet, communal perfection. It was a world of freshly painted mailboxes and perfectly angled garage doors, a place where every blade of grass seemed to stand at attention. In this meticulous tableau, Marcus stood in his garden, a man who moved with a grace born of deep-seated discipline. A retired Marine, his posture remained erect, his movements deliberate. He was a man of few words, his conversations with the world conducted through the patient turning of soil and the careful pruning of new growth. He wore a simple faded t-shirt, its cotton softened by countless washes, and a pair of worn work gloves. His hands, though gnarled with age and service, moved with a gentle precision, coaxing life from the earth. The garden was his sanctuary, a small, vibrant rebellion against the sterile uniformity of the neighborhood. It was his art, his therapy, a place to mourn a future he would never share. But this morning, the stillness was broken by the low rumble of a golf cart. It was the chariot of the self-appointed king of the cul-de-sac, Roger, the HOA's head of community security. Roger was a man who had retired from a desk job and found new purpose in the petty tyranny of community enforcement. His uniform, a crisp polo shirt with a crest he had designed himself, was immaculate. He sat in his cart, a symbol of his perceived authority, a beacon of officious self-importance. The contrast between the two men was stark. Marcus, the veteran who had faced genuine threats, and Roger, the man who had manufactured his own. The golf cart came to a silent stop at the curb. The only sound was the hum of its electric motor and the chirping of birds. Roger's shadow stretched long and thin across Marcus's lawn. The air grew heavy, the golden light turning cold. Roger did not speak. He merely stared, a small, cruel smile on his face. He gestured with a thumb toward a small, ceramic owl nestled in the hostas near the walkway. The owl was a gift, a whimsical detail in an otherwise structured landscape. Roger pointed to a line of text on a clipboard, a violation number, and a series of escalating fines. The charge was for a non-conforming yard ornament and improper shrub height. The words, written in the dry language of bureaucracy, felt like a personal insult. A crowd began to gather, summoned by the silent spectacle. They were neighbors on their morning walks, a few children on bikes. They slowed, their curiosity a palpable thing. They watched Roger, who seemed to puff up with each new observer, and Marcus, who stood with an unblinking stillness that bordered on defiance. The unspoken tension was thick, a drama unfolding on the stage of a suburban street. A woman, a neighbor Marcus had waved to for years, lowered her eyes and pulled her child closer, averting her gaze. This quiet act of turning away was a louder condemnation than any shouted word. The humiliation was total and public. Roger's smile widened. He had won this round without a single word. He tore the violation notice from his clipboard with a flourish, folded it neatly in half, and laid it on the manicured lawn as if placing a gauntlet. He then drove off, the hum of his cart fading into the suffocating silence, leaving Marcus alone with the weight of the moment, the cold paper on his lawn, and the memory of averted eyes. Life had a way of bringing men to their knees, not with a sudden blow, but with a quiet, persistent erosion. For Marcus, the process had begun 2 years ago, when a swift and merciless illness had claimed his wife, Maria. She was the anchor, the laughter that filled the house, the quiet force that had held his world together. When she was gone, a silence had fallen, one so profound it felt like a physical weight. The home, once a vibrant hub of shared history, had become a museum of her absence. The photographs on the mantel, the scent of her perfume on a scarf, the empty side of the bed, each was a reminder of a life cleaved in two. Marcus had served his country, seen things most men only read about in history books, but nothing had prepared him for the quiet desolation of a home without its heart. The garden had been a shared passion, a legacy of Maria's touch. They had planted the first seeds together, their hands in the same soil, their hopes tangled in the roots. After she was gone, the garden withered. For a year, Marcus had barely looked at it. It was too painful, too stark a reminder of a joy he no longer possessed. He had considered selling the house, but the thought of leaving the only place where her spirit still seemed to linger was unbearable. He had retreated into himself, a man adrift in a sea of his own grief. It was an internal battle, a quiet war he fought every day, unseen by the world. Then, one spring morning, he had found himself with a shovel in hand. He had not planned it. He had simply walked outside, drawn by some primal need for connection, and started to dig. He ripped out the weeds and turned the soil, his movements a rhythmic, meditative prayer. The earth, cold and damp against his hands, had felt like a living thing, full of possibility. He worked all day, his muscles aching, the sun warm on his back. That evening, he had looked at the fresh, dark soil, and for the first time in a year, he had felt a flicker of hope. He had begun to tend the garden not just as a hobby, but as a path to healing. The garden became a metaphor for his life, a place to nurture what remained, to pull out the dead parts, and to watch new life push through the soil. But in the past month, the garden had become a battleground. Roger, the head of HOA security, had taken an interest in Marcus's home. It began with subtle scrutiny, a slowing down of a golf cart as it passed, a lingering gaze. Then came the first of a series of petty fines. An accusation of a non-compliant mail receptacle, a charge of unapproved lawn decorations for a small flag that had been on the house for years. Each fine was a small, pointed jab at Marcus's hard-won peace. The psychological toll was immense. The quiet man who had found solace in his garden now found himself constantly looking over his shoulder. The sanctuary was becoming a prison. His solitude, once a source of strength, now felt like a vulnerability. He felt targeted, a lone figure in a sea of conforming houses, standing out simply because he was different, because he was a man living a solitary existence in a family-oriented community. He was an anomaly. His garden, once a source of joy, was becoming a source of conflict. The vibrant, living thing he had nurtured was now an object of contention. It felt like a violation of the most sacred kind, an attack on his last bastion of peace. The final violation, the one about the ceramic owl, was the most personal yet. It was an attack on the whimsical touch his wife had given the garden, a final, cruel act of erasure. The quiet anger that had been simmering beneath the surface of his calm demeanor began to boil. He felt the familiar pull of a conflict he had hoped to leave behind. He was a man of peace, but he was also a man of honor, and the time for passive resistance was running out. The violation notice on the lawn was not just a piece of paper. It was a declaration of war. Over the next 2 weeks, the harassment escalated from passive aggression to a campaign of psychological torment. The golf cart, once a sporadic presence, became a constant shadow. Roger's patrols were relentless, his routes seemingly designed to pass by Marcus's home every hour on the hour. The camera lingers on the cold, indifferent lens of a security camera mounted on Roger's vehicle, a silent, unblinking eye that followed Marcus's every move. The sense of foreboding was suffocating. Every time Marcus stepped outside, he felt the weight of that unseen gaze. The fines began to arrive with brutal efficiency. A charge for a non-compliant bird feeder, a notice for an unapproved color on the front door, a subtle hue of deep crimson that had been there since Marcus had moved in. He ignored the first few, the defiant calm he had cultivated his entire life, holding firm. But the paper piled up, each notice carrying with it the cold weight of a lien, of an eventual threat to his property itself. The neighborhood, a once friendly place, grew tense. Neighbors who had once offered a friendly wave now scurried past, their gazes lowered, their faces a mask of strained politeness. They were witnesses to the unfolding drama, too fearful of Roger's retribution to intervene. Their inaction was a form of silent complicity, and it stung Marcus more than any fine could. He was an island, a solitary figure fighting a battle that no one else was willing to acknowledge. Then Roger moved his campaign from the digital realm of fines to a physical, public confrontation. One sweltering afternoon, Marcus was at the community mailbox collecting the latest stack of fines. A small group of neighbors were there as well, a silent, uneasy audience. The squeal of tires cut through the humid air as Roger's golf cart screeched to a halt in the middle of the street. Roger stood up, his hand on his hip, a picture of arrogant bravado. He pointed at Marcus, a dismissive sneer on his face. He spoke loud enough for everyone to hear, his voice an ugly, triumphant bellow. He mocked Marcus's solitude, his quiet, introspective nature. He called him a blight on the community, a man who refused to conform. The crowd of neighbors shifted uncomfortably, a few mumbling under their breath, but none daring to meet Marcus's eyes. Marcus simply stared back at Roger, his face a mask of stone. He did not flinch, did not cower, did not utter a single word in his own defense. The humiliation was not in the words, but in the silence of the witnesses. Roger, fueled by this lack of resistance, leaned into the moment, his voice growing louder, more contemptuous. He took a step toward Marcus, his chest puffed out, a caricature of a man in control. The other neighbors began to back away, a quiet retreat from the escalating tension. The air thrummed with unspoken violence. Marcus remained still, his hands at his sides, his shoulders squared. His silence was a form of power, an unblinking refusal to engage. The crowd of neighbors was now a hushed half-circle, a collection of passive spectators, watching the moment build to its inevitable, ugly climax. Roger, frustrated by Marcus's stoicism, reached into his golf cart. He pulled out a small black object, a flashlight, and from the holster at his hip, he pulled a second, more sinister one. The glint of steel caught the afternoon sun. A pistol. He held it in a theatrical, almost absurd gesture, pointing it at the asphalt between Marcus's feet. The sight of it was enough. The tension that had been building for weeks snapped. A woman screamed. A child cried. The neighbors scattered, running for the safety of their homes, leaving Marcus alone in the street. The world narrowed to a single, terrifying tableau. The humid air, once thick with the buzzing of insects, was now a vacuum of silence. Time seemed to crawl. There was only the sight of the pistol, a dull metallic black, held in the shaky, triumphant hand of Roger. The weapon was a symbol of his ultimate claim to authority, a final, reckless act of unchecked power. It was a hollow symbol, a piece of theater meant to intimidate, but it carried a deadly weight. Marcus, the man who had seen the real thing, stood unblinking. His gaze remained locked on Roger, a stillness in his eyes that spoke not of fear, but of a cold, weary recognition. The narration describes the subtle tremble in Roger's hands, a hint of his own terror beneath the bravado. A low, distant wail began to grow in the stillness, cutting through the heavy air. The sound grew from a faint wisp to a piercing shriek, a two-tone siren that seemed to arrive from all directions at once. The sound was an immediate, visceral jolt. The sirens were not a background noise. They were an intentional, focused intrusion. Roger, startled, flinched. His eyes, wide with panic, darted toward the sound. Marcus, for the first time, allowed a subtle shift in his expression. The faintest flicker of a grim smile touched the corner of his lips. The sirens grew to a crescendo, a blinding wall of sound that filled the street as 3 squad cars converged on the scene. They were not patrol cars. These were unmarked, sleek black SUVs, the kind that moved with a quiet, purposeful authority. They parked haphazardly, their lights strobing in the afternoon sun, a silent ballet of focused intervention. The sound of their engines cutting off was a final, punctuating note of stillness. 2 figures emerged from the lead SUV. They were not patrolmen in standard uniform. They wore crisp black tactical polos, the word police emblazoned in white across their chests. They moved with a disciplined, almost preternatural calm. One of the figures was tall and broad-shouldered, a man who commanded a presence with a simple straightening of his posture. He carried himself with a palpable sense of purpose, an authority that was earned, not borrowed. He stopped, his eyes sweeping the scene, the pistol in Roger's hand, the terrified, bewildered look on Roger's face, the quiet, unblinking stillness of Marcus. The tall man's gaze settled on Marcus, and profound change came over his face. The cool professionalism was replaced by an almost imperceptible wave of emotion, a flicker of relief, of concern, of a deep and personal connection. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his eyes never leaving Marcus's. The action was not confrontational, but deeply protective. The narration describes the silent exchange between the 2 men, a conversation without a single word. A father and a son, their eyes meeting across a distance of years and a chasm of experience. The moment was not a surprise to Marcus, but a long-awaited vindication. The twist was in the recognition, in the silent, powerful understanding that this was not a random intervention. This was a son answering a distress call, a chief of police responding to an attack on the one man he held most dear. The tall man reached out a hand, not toward the gun, but toward his father. His palm was open, a gesture of unwavering support. The truth was not shouted, but manifested in that singular, powerful movement. The revelation was not spoken, but its impact was a physical shockwave that rippled through the onlookers. The few neighbors who had scattered to the safety of their homes now stood frozen at their windows, their faces pressed against the glass. The man in charge, the new figure of undeniable power, was the son of the quiet man they had silently watched being tormented for weeks. The disbelief was a palpable thing. The narration describes the collective gasp, the sudden, silent shift in their perception of Marcus, a man they had written off as a harmless victim. He was now seen for what he was, a figure of immense, understated dignity, deeply connected to a power that dwarfed their own trivial concerns. Roger's collapse was immediate and total. The arrogance that had fueled his petty tyranny evaporated like mist in the morning sun. The air was sucked from his chest, his shoulders slumped, and the pistol, once a symbol of his authority, now hung heavy and ridiculous in his trembling hand. The narration uses a high-angle shot, making him appear small and insignificant, a foolish man trapped by the very theatricality he had embraced. His eyes, once full of a triumphant malice, darted around in frantic desperation, searching for an escape that did not exist. The chief of police did not shout, did not make a single sudden movement. His voice, when it came, was low and calm, a steel-edged command that cut through the silence. "Secure the weapon," he said, his eyes on the pistol. A second officer, a man who moved with the same quiet authority, stepped forward. His movements were precise, his hands deliberate. He took the pistol from Roger's grasp with a smooth, almost gentle motion, as if taking a dangerous toy from a misbehaving child. Roger's fingers, however, were clenched in a white-knuckled grip, a final act of pathetic defiance. The officer had to pry them loose, finger by finger. The action was described in excruciating detail, a silent, public dismantling of Roger's false authority. The narration describes the shame on Roger's face, a scarlet flush of belated self-awareness. The chief did not look at Roger. He kept his gaze fixed on Marcus, the man he called Dad, his eyes filled with a deep, silent apology for the world's cruelty. The chief then turned to his subordinate. "Call internal affairs," he commanded, his voice a low and serious hum. The command was not for Marcus's sake alone. It was an act of professional integrity. The incident involved the use of a firearm and a private citizen. It required a formal, impartial investigation. The chief was demonstrating true authority, a commitment to due process and the law, even when his personal interests were at stake. The crowd, silent and stunned, watched as the officers, in a fluid, practiced motion, moved toward Roger. There were no handcuffs, no dramatic pronouncements. Roger was simply led away, a pathetic, defeated figure, his head bowed, his shoulders sagging in abject humiliation. The man who had sought to enforce his will with a fabricated sense of power was now under the control of genuine authority. The days that followed were a testament to the slow, deliberate grind of justice. The narrative pivots from the dramatic confrontation to the meticulous, unseen process of accountability. The news of the incident spread like wildfire, a story too cinematic to be confined to a single neighborhood. The narration describes the flood of local news reports, the flashing headlines, the low hum of television anchors recounting the tale of the fake HOA cop. The story, once a private affair, was now a public spectacle, and the HOA was caught in the cold, harsh light of legal scrutiny. The internal affairs investigation was swift and without compromise. The chief of police, upholding his ethical duty, had recused himself from any direct involvement beyond the initial securing of the scene. He had established a clear boundary, demonstrating his unwavering commitment to the department's integrity over his personal ties. The investigation confirmed that Roger had no legal right to detain anyone, let alone brandish a weapon. His actions were not an overstep of authority, but a criminal act. Charges were filed, not just for assault with a deadly weapon, but for impersonating a law enforcement officer, a serious offense. The legal scrutiny did not stop with Roger. The community's neighbors, once so quick to turn their heads, were now an outraged and unified force. The narration describes their transformation from fearful bystanders to activists. They held their own meetings, demanding to know what authority the HOA board had to hire an armed security guard, and how they had failed to provide proper oversight. The board, suddenly facing the threat of lawsuits, was forced to reevaluate its bylaws. The once private rules were now public documents, every line, every word, a potential liability. The HOA, a once unassailable bastion of petty power, was now a beleaguered bureaucracy, its authority shattered. And for Marcus, the resolution was not a grand triumph, but a quiet, profound vindication. The neighbors, once so quick to avert their eyes, now approached him with a newfound respect. They brought him coffee in the morning, offered to help in his garden, and looked at him with a silent, profound apology in their eyes. The once whispered gossip was now replaced by genuine admiration for his quiet dignity. His garden was no longer an object of contention, but a beacon of resilience, a symbol of the justice he had so patiently, so silently fought for. He had not sought out a fight. He had simply refused to cower. And in his quiet defiance, he had exposed a truth about power, both false and real. He was a man of peace, but he was also a man who had earned his respect, and the neighborhood, once a place of thorns, was now his home again. The final reflection on the story is a meditation on the nature of authority, the true meaning of power, and the quiet dignity of a man who has found a way to stand firm in a world that asks him to conform. The narration returns to Marcus in his garden. The sun that now shines on the hostas feels different, is not a cold, indifferent light, but a warm, healing one, as if the universe itself has acknowledged the shift in the moral balance of the world. The lesson of the story is not a grand, earth-shattering pronouncement. It is a subtle, profound truth, like a seed that takes root in the dark soil before it pushes through toward the light. The first lesson is a simple, yet powerful one, that true authority is not granted, but earned. Roger's power was a costume, a role he played with a prop. It had no foundation in law, no basis in discipline, and no respect from anyone but himself. It was hollow. The chief's authority, on the other hand, was a force of nature, calm, precise, and rooted in a deep sense of responsibility and integrity. He did not have to make a show of his power. He simply had to exercise it with purpose and discipline. His first act, to call for an impartial investigation, demonstrated that his power was not for personal gain, but for the good of the institution and the community he served. He was a protector of the law, not just an enforcer. The second lesson is one of quiet dignity and the strength of the unseen man. In a world of loud voices and endless posturing, Marcus had chosen the path of silence, of calm resilience. He did not fight fire with fire. He simply stood still, his stillness a mirror reflecting the ugliness of the man before him. He refused to cower, and in that refusal, he had won the most important battle of all. His victory was not in the humiliation of his tormentor, but in the rediscovery of his own peace and the reclamation of his sanctuary. His strength was not in a physical confrontation, but in the fortitude of his spirit. The final scene is a return to where it all began. Marcus is once again in his garden, a place that now feels like his true home. The camera focuses on the small, beautiful details, a single drop of water on a leaf, the rich, dark soil turning under his trowel, the gentle touch of his fingers on a newly sprouted plant. The narration describes the silence of the street, now not as an act of avoidance, but as a sign of respect. Neighbors offer quiet waves and knowing smiles. The peace that had been stolen from him has been returned, not by a grand gesture of revenge, but by the quiet, deliberate process of justice. The story ends with a wide-angle shot of the neighborhood, the community now held together not by the iron fist of a zealous volunteer, but by the silent, powerful, and enduring bonds of shared respect. The garden, once a place of thorns, is now a garden of peace, a living testament to the victory of dignity over humiliation, of true authority over the false.